Hello, class. I just wanted to record a brief lecture covering Stanley Milgram's quite famous article on the behavioral study of obedience. I think it's important to start with a little context first before I go into details about the journal article itself. We've already discussed this a little bit in the ethics chapter, but I think there's quite a bit more to understand. Throughout history, people, specifically soldiers, have followed orders, even though those orders have included, doing abhorrent things. And, there's plenty of examples through history to point to the Armenian genocide by the Turks, the Nazi slaughter of the Jews and other dissidents, the Serbian slaughters of Bosnian and Kosovar Muslims, the Hutus and the Tutsis slaughtering each other in Rwanda in the 90s. So this is nothing new in human history. But there's always this question as to why would people engage in these behaviors, and more importantly, it poses the question: how many of us would refuse to follow such orders, or would we be, willing and capable to do the same things under the wrong circumstances? So, studying obedience is a really important topic in the sort of social influence side of psychology. It really wants to know, this area of study wants to know how people alter their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors to sort of go along with social influence. And there are circumstances where obedience is useful and helpful, like, for example, obeying the sirens so that an ambulance can pass your car in an emergency, children obeying reasonable demands of their parents to be safe, that kind of thing. But there is a dark side to obedience, obviously, and this tendency of many, perhaps most people, to obey authority figures, even when those authority figures make immoral demands, is sort of a frightening side of humanity. So therefore, it's fertile ground for lots of research. So as I mentioned in the ethics lecture, Milgram was very inspired by what happened in World War II, specifically the war crimes associated with the Nazis, and looking at how people obeyed them. Now, there's plenty of theories about this. There's an excellent book, it's actually behind me somewhere in this mess, called Hitler's Willing Executioners. It was very controversial, that came out in the late 90s, that was about the idea of the Einsatzgruppen and all. It was not, sort of just the SS and the elite German military that were engaged in the Holocaust. There were plenty of local sort of fascist groups, and some that were not even necessarily associated with fascism, but plenty of groups that collaborated and assisted. And so there's been lots of study as to how people are capable of this. As you can imagine, Milgram working in the 60s is not that far away from World War II. It's certainly much closer historically than it feels now to us. And there was a lot of interest in understanding how people were capable of doing the things they had done. So in the opening paragraph of his article, which we'll look at in a second, he very specifically kind of asks the question and connects the study to understanding the actions of the Nazis. So he wants to understand how people could do things not just, in wartime, but assisting in the construction and operation of gas chambers, and, this sort of mechanized system that resulted in the deaths of millions of innocent people. So who are these people that placed obedience ahead of, life and humanity? Is their psychology different from ours, in any way? Or could we be, very similar in our behavior? So let's walk through a little bit of the background of the study before we get into the details of the article. What I would recommend is that you have the article in front of you. If you don't, you can pause this and grab the article and kind of follow along with me as we go. The experiments that Milgram conducted began in 1961. The article's not published until 1963, which is not uncommon. Sometimes there's a process of writing things up and having them submitted, and it takes a little while. But it was conducted in the basement of a hall at Yale University. 3 months after the start of the trial of Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. So in this early 60s, Adolf Eichmann was actually he was arrested by agents of the Mossad in Israel, and they brought him back to Jerusalem for his war crime. Now, Eichmann was associated with the Holocaust. He was an SS member. He was, a commandant at Auschwitz. And so the question was, people were thinking a lot about people like Adolf Eichmann and other members. It was back in the consciousness, back in the zeitgeist quite a bit in the early 60s because of his trial. And Eichmann was eventually hung by the Israelis. So the question that was sort of there was this age-old defense that's come back. It was very famously dismissed at Nuremberg, was the idea of, could Eichmann and his million accomplices in the Holocaust, could they say they were just following orders? Are they essentially accomplices to the crime, or are they simply doing what they were told by authority? Now, of course, the outcome of the Nuremberg trials was that that is not a defense. That ultimately, basic human morality and decency takes precedence over orders. And so it was one of the first times in history that it was really stated very clearly that that is no longer a viable defense for committing things like war crimes or genocide. You can't simply say I was following orders. You're still, in many cases, legally liable for those actions based upon that precedent. So this was the idea that was in Milgram's mind. This is what was going on in the culture at the time. One of the things that Milgram did is he went and he polled a lot of people prior to the study to get expectations. So what he was particularly interested in was how people thought they would behave and versus how they actually did behave. So he started by polling 14, now again, 14, very small number. He polled 14 Yale University senior year psychology students and asked them to predict the behavior of 100 hypothetical participants in the study that he was describing. All of the poll respondents believed that only a very small fraction of the participants, ranging from 0 to 3 out of 100 in their answers, with an average of 1.2, would be prepared to inflict the maximum voltage. He also informally polled a lot of his colleagues and found that they too believed very few would do this. He reached out to Harvard University graduate, honorary Harvard University graduate Chaim Hamnek, who was a survivor, and he noted that he felt that the experiment would not be concrete evidence of the Nazis' innocence. He said that poor people are more likely to cooperate. There were lots of theories about what would dictate people's behavior, but essentially most people did not think that people would go through with it. He polled 40 psychiatrists from the medical school, and they believed that by the 10th shock, including the victim's demands that they be freed, most subjects would stop the experiment. So they basically said that, by the time you get to that 300-volt shock where the subject, remember this is a Confederate who's part of the study, refuses to answer, they thought only 3.73% on average of the subjects would still continue. And so they essentially believed that only about 10%, 1/10 of 1% of the subjects would administer the highest shock on the board. So basically everyone from various disciplines of various levels of education about human behavior and humanity stood up and said, no, I don't think that many people are going to go all the way through with this. And what's really interesting is that Milgram himself had a similar expectation. Now, there was a lot of discussion after the war about the German character, quote unquote. This idea that perhaps there was something unique about German culture, about Germans in particular, that allowed them to engage in these behaviors, these war crimes in the Holocaust, that was distinct from other cultures, from other people. Now, this is probably driven a lot by a holdover from a lot of sort of systemic racism towards the Germans, not to defend the Germans whatsoever, obviously, but, if you consider World War I and even in the 19th century, there was a lot of wars in Europe, and there was a lot of propaganda going back and forth, and some of that propaganda had been very successful in England and America in portraying the Germans as being sort of distinct and unique in their character, as being more bloodthirsty, more ruthless, so to speak. So what he was essentially thinking is that Americans, the American exceptionalism that we're so fond of, would serve as a control group, that he would conduct the experiment with Americans, and then he planned to go use German participants. And he expected that the German participants, even 20 years after the war, would behave closer to how the Nazis did. He was really unprepared for the results that he got. He was unprepared for how the Americans in his study responded. And then ultimately this study has been replicated across culture, across various different settings, and there's been tons of different aspects of it broken out and looked at in different studies. But there tends to be some universality that people will obey authority to the point of even potentially harming someone for no other reason than just our human tendency to do so. So let's move a little bit to the actual study itself. So I have the article here with me, and I appreciate if you go along with me as we go through it. There's a few things I want you to see here, just to understand a little bit about articles in general. As I've mentioned, this article is from 1963, so it is older than most of the, it's not a modern study, and it has a sort of antiquated feel and structure in the way that the language is written. We'll talk about the introduction in a moment, but generally speaking, it's very different than a modern research study would look. So at the very beginning, what you see here is this was published in the Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology, which is a very reputable APA journal, 1963. Stanley Milgram is the only author, and it conducted at Yale University. So that first little block of text you see at the top of the page there, that's called the abstract, the one that's sort of center justified. This is sort of meant to be a quick summary of the whole study. I won't get into that too much, but as we jump right into the introduction, one of the things that stands out very quickly is that this is an antiquated structure to an introduction of a journal article. You will not see them like this. First and foremost, it is extremely brief. All right, it's really just 2 columns at most. It's very, very quick. There is not really a single reference in it except the quote to C.P. Snow. There's a quote from C.P. Snow, excuse me, in the second column there that you can see. The one that starts off, "When you think of the long and gloomy history of man." This is not how studies are conducted today. And when we look at some modern studies, we'll talk a little bit about this. The narrative literature review is entirely absent as we know it today. You would typically want to see lots of references with, linking back to other articles establishing research on obedience and authority. This is in the somewhat early days of empirical psychology. Maybe there's not much to draw upon, right? But it is very different than what you're going to see in a modern study. But what he does do is he talks a little bit about the concept of obedience very briefly. He defines it as the psychological mechanism that links individual action to political purpose. It is the dispositional cement that binds men to systems of authority. Facts of recent history and observation in daily life suggest that many persons' obedience may be a deeply ingrained behavior tendency, indeed a prepotent impulse overriding training in ethics, sympathy, and moral conduct. So he's really talking about the ugly side of obedience here in the introduction. He also talks about how the type of obedience that he's studying in this particular study is perhaps an antecedent to full-blown violence or genocide, but he feels that it does serve to help us to understand how those things happen in the real world. So he very quickly moves into the procedure itself. And it's a somewhat, it's a very clever and a very elegant design in some ways. But essentially what's happening is you have a naive subject, someone who's unaware of what the purpose of the study is, coming in and being asked to administer electric shock to a victim. This is the highly known and controversial aspect of this study. Now, it's a simulated shock generator. That's an important thing I want you to recognize. There are no shocks being delivered whatsoever in this study. It's entirely fake in that sense. We'll talk about how he went to great lengths to make it seem real, though. So this simulated shock generator has 30 clearly marked voltage levels ranging from 15 to 450 volts. And they have also little verbal designations, qualifiers that say what those numbers represent to give the person a more of a connection to what it is they're doing. So at the earlier side, the 15-volt side, it says slight shock, and it goes all the way up to danger: severe shock, right? So there's these labels underneath the numbers, giving you an indication of how severe they are. The responses of the victim in this case, is the confederate, right? And when we use the term confederate in a research study, what we're talking about is someone who is part of the study. They are essentially an actor who is part of the experiment. They are recruited by the researcher, and they are sort of instructed to play a certain role. And the confederate has standardized responses. They do it exactly the same for each subject. So they respond in the same way each time we go through this process. The order to administer the shocks are given in the experimenter gives these orders to continue administering shocks. They're given in a very structured way as well. So there is some scientific rigor in this design. Even though it's a somewhat old-fashioned study, he does follow some important aspects of systematic regimen and how it's delivered. What they're told is that it's a learning experiment. Participants are informed this is a learning experiment ostensibly set up to study the effects of punishment on memory. So as the experiment continues, the person is commanded to administer increasingly more intense shocks to the victim, even reaching this point of danger, severe shock. And so the idea is he wants to start pushing up against people's internal resistances to doing these things and seeing where they quit, essentially. Any behavior prior to quitting is defined as obedience. So that's his operational definition of obedience, is continuing to administer shocks when given the order to do so. And And then at some point, obviously in his study, he was expecting people relatively early on to refuse to go forward. That he calls that the point of rupture, or the act of disobedience. Okay, and so that's sort of a quantitative value he can assign, which is what's the maximum shock that the person was willing to deliver. So on that scale of 15 to 450, he can then operationalize that person's degree of obedience by the number of how many shocks they were willing to give. So that's sort of how he operationalizes this concept of obedience, this larger hypothetical construct. The crux of the study is to systematically vary the factors believed to alter the degrees of obedience as the experiment goes on. The technique allows important variables to be manipulated. So he can talk about the content of the commands. The commands change. They sort of escalate and become more insistent as time goes on. And we'll talk about this in detail. But what he's really trying to get to here is the process of obedience from a socio-psychological standpoint. He does reference a few related studies here, so there are some references. They come a little late, and they're sort of very brief here on the second page. I'm on technically page 372 of the journal is what you should be seeing. And then he moves into talking about the method, and this is where I want to spend a little bit of time just kind of helping to understand the scientific design of this. So this is where also some controversy comes in regarding Milgram's study. The subjects were 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50. They were drawn from the New Haven, Connecticut community that surrounds Yale. They were obtained by a newspaper advertisement and direct mail solicitation. So this is back when you could just go through, the phone book and mail things directly to people. Those who responded to the appeal believed, like I said, they were participating in a study on memory and learning at Yale. He claims there were a wide range of occupations represented in the sample, everything from postal clerks, high school teachers, salesmen, engineers, laborers. They ranged in educational level quite a bit, from one who had not finished elementary school up to one who had a doctorate and other professional degrees. They were paid $4.50 for their participation in the experiment, which at the time was was nothing to scoff at. Was not a lot of money, not enough to be considered coercive. But they are told, and this is a really important thing, you have to look for confounds, right? Let's say that someone who, doesn't make very much money really needs that 450. You don't want to introduce that payment. Now, the payment is done to sort of, justify their time and as a way to recruit people, but it can't be so much money that it's coercive. And it can't be done in a way where the person is then going to go through the shocks in order to get this money. Now, that's kind of dark to think about, but it is a possible confound. So the way he controls for that is he says, as soon as they arrive, he says, the money's yours. You don't have to participate. You can walk out right now if you want to. You still get the 450. So that's how they deal with that possible confound. And there's a table here that shows sort of the proportion of age and what they did for a living. The experiments conducted on the grounds of Yale University in what he calls an elegant interaction laboratory. Now, as you can imagine, Yale, an Ivy League school, he conducts this in a very sort of venerable and ivory tower style building, and so there's some discussion as to whether or not the setting has a little bit of power over the patient's willingness to participate. Is there some sort of inherent authority in the fact that, we're doing this at Yale, right? The role of the experimenter is not actually Stanley Milgram. That also is essentially a Confederate. It's someone who's hired. He was a 31-year-old high school teacher of biology. And he was recruited because his manner was, quote-unquote, impassive and his appearance somewhat stern throughout the experiment. He was dressed in a gray technician's coat. I make the mistake often of saying a white lab coat. It's a gray lab coat, essentially. The victim, right, the Confederate, is played by a 47-year-old accountant who was then trained for his role. He was apparently of Irish-American stock, whom most observers found mild-mannered and likable. All right. So the naive subject, the person who's unaware of the actual intent of the study, comes in with the accomplice, the Confederate, the quote-unquote victim, at the same time. They're essentially brought in under this cover story that they're both participants there showing up today to take part in the study. And they're told the following. So they're told, we know very little about the effect of punishment on learning, although it's, there's been studies that have been done. We want to learn more. We want to know how much punishment is best for learning, and we don't know what the differences are in terms of reinforcement. So in this study, we're bringing together a number of adults of different occupations and ages, and we're asking some of them to be teachers and some of them to be learners. And so the idea is they even ask, do you, either of you have a preference? But then what's ultimately done is there are slips of paper from a hat that are drawn. Now this part of the study, there's some deception right here as well, is fixed. The person who the participant in the study always is assigned to be the quote unquote teacher, right? The one administering the shock. So it's rigged. So the naive subject is always the one who ends up being the teacher. The confederate always ends up being the learner. Okay, so both of the slips contain the word teacher. You just always have the naive subject draw first. The learner, remember the confederate, is then taken to an adjacent room. Okay, and they're strapped into an electric chair, quote unquote, electric chair apparatus. The experimenter explains while the subject is there watching how the straps can prevent excessive movement while the learner is being shocked. So the idea is that it's becoming very clear to the person who's then going to administer these fake shocks that the person can't escape, right? That they're sort of stuck there. And so the electrode is attached to the learner's wrist, and electrode paste is applied. And then there was these statements, well, we do this to avoid blisters and burns, right? So they're really implying we're putting this, gel on here so that the electrical shock does not blister or burn the person's skin. They're then told that this electrode is attached to the shock generator, which is on the other side of the wall in the adjoining room. So in order to improve the credibility, the experimenter declared in response to the question by the learner, the learner says, hey, how's this going to go? The confederate is asked to make a statement, hey, is this going to hurt? That kind of thing. And what the person says, the experimenter says in this case, is although the shocks can be extremely painful, they can cause no permanent tissue damage, right? So that's also presented in the presence of the subject. So the actual task itself is what's called a paired associates learning task. Basically, if you've ever played the game Memory, where you flip over cards and you have to memorize them, the idea is that it's related to that concept. The idea is that the person is ostensibly learning two words connected together. So when you give them the first word, they are then expected to have learned the connected word and repeat it back. So it's you read the first word and then you read four other terms, and they say, which one of these is it? And the quote-unquote learner, right, the confederate, remember I'm going to emphasize that, will then push a button, 4 switches. They have 4 switches in front of them, which then gives their answer, right? So there's no verbal communication between the two. There's only the switches then cause it to light up on the board in front of the subject, so they can see there's like 4 numbered quadrants, and they can see what their response was to this multiple choice question. So the shock generator, the quote-unquote shock generator, is an instrument that was created to look very formidable and to look very real. It's a big box that has 30 lever switches across it in a horizontal line. Each of them is clearly labeled with a voltage designation that ranges from 15 to 450, and they go up in 15-volt increments. From left to right. Then there's those verbal designations that say, that go along the bottom that kind of indicate qualitatively what do these shocks represent. So you've got things like slight shock, moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, danger, severe shock. The 2 last switches on the right were designated XXX, right? So just, really kind of playing this up a little bit, that they're pretty serious despite being told this won't cause any serious tissue damage. So when you depress a switch, a pilot light corresponds to each switch is illuminated in bright red, and then you hear an electric buzzing noise. There's an electric blue light that's labeled voltage energizer that flashes, and the dial on the voltage meter swings to the right, and there's these various relay clicks. So there's lots of things built into this device to make it feel really real. When on the upper left-hand corner of the generator, it's labeled Shock Generator Type ZLB, Dyson Instrument Company, Waltham, Massachusetts, output 15 volts to 450 volts. There was a lot of details that were carefully handled to give this thing an authentic feel. The subjects, right, the people who are the teachers who are naive to what's going on, are actually given a sample shock. It was set up so that this generator could actually put out a small 45-volt shock. And it's applied by pressing the 3rd switch on the generator, and the shock is applied to the wrist of the subject, which is 45 volts is very minimal. This is low amperage, so it doesn't really hurt, but it feels, you can feel it, right? It's detectable, and it's not pleasant necessarily. And so the person is kind of shown, look, this thing actually produces shock. So that's part of the deception that takes place. And these are the instructions that the participant is given, right? They're told by the experimenter to administer a shock to the learner each time they give a wrong response. And this is the key command. The subject is instructed to move one level higher on the shock generator each time the learner gives a wrong answer. And they're also instructed to announce the voltage level out loud before administering it. So they have to say 45 volts to press the lever, right? It has to be a very deliberate and complete and clear decision to do so. This serves to continually remind the subject that the intensity of the shocks is going up. So this is all designed to increase the salience, the visceral nature of this experiment. They do some pretest, to kind of show that the procedure of reading words and administering shocks works and how the process is. There's a little bit of practice that goes on, and there are some words that the person gets right, some words they get wrong, but they're not receiving any shocks yet. And then you're presented with the second list and said, okay, this is the experiment. And they're told to go through the list. And they say when you get to the bottom of the list, repeat it over again and continue giving shocks until the learner has learned all the pairs correctly. So there's a built-in mechanism where this is going to escalate if the person makes mistakes. And then they are given the following instruction: start from 15 volts, increase the shock level one step each time the learner gives the wrong answer. So the responses that are given by the switches is already predetermined, right? It's very much the same in every single subject's experience. So based on a schedule of approximately 3 wrong answers to 1 correct. So they give a lot of wrong answers, meaning there's a lot of shocks that need to be administered. There's no vocal response or heard. There's no response at all from the person in the other room who's ostensibly receiving these shocks, right? They're really not, but until you reach level 300. When you reach level 300 volts, the learner, the confederate on the other side of the wall, pounds on the wall. All right. The idea perhaps is, they are bound. So that doesn't mean they're kicking the wall, right? But they're hitting the wall in some way. And the pounding can be heard by the subject. And after that pounding, they don't give any other answers. Now, a lot of times what happens is, for most people, the subject will then turn to the experimenter and look for guidance. Like, wait a minute, did you hear that? What's going on here? The experimenter has a very regimented response, right? They instruct the subject to treat the absence of a response as a wrong answer. Okay. The fact that the person is not depressing any switches and they're not making another noise after they pounded on the wall, if you give them a few seconds, if in 5 to 10 seconds they haven't answered, you have to administer another shock, right? And so they say after 5 or 10 seconds, you consider no response a wrong answer, and then to increase the shock level one step each time they fail to respond correctly. The learner then pounds on the wall one more time at 315 volts, and afterwards they do not do anything else and they don't give any more responses. Okay. So the implication of that's pretty clear, right? The idea is that this person is objecting, and then they are giving no response, which is, can be interpreted that something very bad has happened. They could be, they could be unconscious, they could be unable to respond, they could be dead, right? Something bad has happened. At various points in the experiment, subjects typically turn to the experimenter for advice on whether, should we keep doing this? Like, is this okay? That kind of thing. Or they may indicate, I don't think I want to do this anymore, right? The experimenter, who, remember, has been hired to play this role, has a very regimented response. If the subject indicates an unwillingness to go forward, they are then prodded, right, verbally. And these prods go through a series and they escalate. So prod 1, you use as many as necessary to get the person to administer the shock. Prod 1 is please continue or please go on. Right? If the person continues to resist, you say the experiment requires that you continue. That's prod 2. Prod 3, it is absolutely essential that you continue. And prod 4, you have no other choice, you must go on. So these prods are given in sequence. So if prod 1 is unsuccessful, you go on to prod 2. If the subject refused to obey the experiment after prod 4, the experiment's terminated. So after prod 4, when the person says you have no other choice, you must go on, if the subject says, no, I'm not doing this, then you stop the subject. You stop the experiment right at that point. The experimenter's tone of voice is supposed to be at all times firm, but not loud, not impolite, not yelling. It's just very straightforward in that way. There are some special prods as well. If the learner says something like, I'm sorry, if the subject says, isn't the learner going to have permanent injury, like am I hurting them, that kind of thing, the person's response, the prod is, although the shocks may be painful, there is no permanent tissue damage, so please go on. And they continue with the prods escalating. If the subject said the learner did not want to go on, if they say, I don't think this guy wants to do this experiment anymore, you say, whether the learner likes it or not, you must go on until he has learned all the word pairs correctly, so please proceed. And then again, you escalate prod 2, prod 3, prod 4. So this is the mechanics of the study, right? This is how the basic study is carried out. The primary dependent variable here, right, the outcome, is how many shocks the person gives. This can go from 0, if they refuse to give the first one, to 30, which is the 450 volt. That's the person who gives the highest shock. Anybody who breaks off the experiment at any point before the last shock, the 30th shock, is considered a defiant subject. One who completes the entire process, who follows the experimental commands and obeys, is considered an obedient subject. Okay. Now, of course, an important part of this is the idea that there is a very significant interview and what they call a de-hoaxing, what we would now call a debriefing at the end. So once the experiment is done, they are, first and foremost, they are reunited with the subject, right? The learner, the person who's the Confederate. I'm okay, nothing bad happened to me. So they get to see that person. They get to understand, hey, there was deception involved in this study. Now we're going to explain why. So he talks about how procedures were undertaken to ensure the subject would leave the laboratory in a state of well-being, as he describes it. So that, like I said, there's a friendly reconciliation between the subject and the victim, and the effort is made, as he says, to reduce the tensions associated with the experiment. So he goes on here to mention what he calls preliminary notions in his results section, and this is where he talks about the surveys that he did and the expectations that he had. Here's the interesting thing. Sorry, let me kill that. Sorry about that. I had to pause for a moment to turn off my phone. We were talking about the results. So, as I said, Milgram's expectation was that there would be very few people that would administer all of the shocks. All 40 of the subjects went beyond the expected break-off point. Right? They all obeyed far more than they were expected to. No subject stopped prior to administering shock level 20. Remember, that's the 300 volts. That's the one where the victim kicks the wall and no longer provides any answers. Everyone went to that point. Okay, of the 40, 5 refused to obey beyond that point. So once the subject, once the learner kicks the wall, only 5 of the 40 said, no, I'm done. I'm not going forward anymore. You know, they got the 4 prods. They said, no, I'm not going to continue. 4 more subjects administered 1 further shock and then refused to go on. So now we're 9 out of 40 stopped after the 315 volts. 2 broke off at 330 and 1 each at 345, 360, and 375. What that means then is 14 subjects out of 40 defied the experimenter at all, showed any defiance whatsoever. The remainder, the 26 remaining, went all the way to the end of the process. And this is really what was important about what was going on in the study, was the number of people that were able to continue going forward. There's a table on page 376 that shows you the cutoff points. So let's talk a little bit about the interpretations and the discussion, and then sort of the larger implications of the study. So the sheer strength of obedient tendencies was really what was overwhelming about this result. The fact that 26 people out of 40 obeyed the experimenter to the end, proceeding to punish the victim until they reached that most potent shock, was pretty surprising for everyone involved. Once they've delivered the maximum shocks, the experimental then would call a halt to the proceedings, and then they go through that debriefing process. He talks about how many of the subjects in the study were sort of like sweating. They breathed a sigh of relief when it was over. They would rub their fingers over their eyes. They nervously fumbled for a cigarette. Remember, it's 1961. Some shook their heads, like apparently showing regret. Some had remained calm throughout the experiment and displayed only minimal signs of tension from beginning to end. So he talks a lot about what this means. First of all, like I said, he underestimated the amount of obedience. The second unanticipated effect, which is, I think, kind of crazy, this was unanticipated, was the extraordinary tension generated by the procedure. He was kind of surprised by the fact that people responded like they did, which to me doesn't really make sense. He may have underestimated people's empathy, I guess. But there's a quote from the article. He says, one observer related, I observed a mature and initially poised businessman enter the laboratory smiling and confident. Within 20 minutes, he was reduced to a twitching, stuttering wreck who was rapidly approaching a point of nervous collapse. He constantly pulled on his earlobe and twisted his hands. At one point, he pushed his fist into his forehead and muttered, "Oh God, let's stop it." And yet he continued to respond to every word of the experimenter and obeyed to the end. So there's a few features that he talks about in terms of the study and what he thinks are important to understand in terms of interpretations. He talks about how it takes place on the grounds of Yale University and sort of this unimpeachable reputation that Yale has in New Haven, and how that might have had some impact. He talks about how he feels it did have a worthy purpose, that it was conducted with some value that made the deception worthwhile. He talks about how the subject perceives that the victim has voluntarily submitted to authority, and how that's different than someone who's a captive or someone who has against their will being put through some sort of torture. He also points out that the subject entered the experiment voluntarily and perceives themselves as sort of under an obligation to aid the experimenter to continue. And he talked a little bit about the money, but he also mentioned the fact that the person could very easily say no and still receive the money. And also the importance of the fact that it seems to look like chance, right? Remember that the assignment is fixed, but the person who becomes the teacher, who's the actual subject, they don't know that. So he thinks that maybe the idea that you look at it and say, well, it was luck that I ended up being the one not receiving these shocks, that somehow that influenced their ability to continue forward. And he says maybe there's also ambiguity about what are the corresponding rights of the subject, as they relate to the prerogative of the psychologist, the researcher. What kind of power do they really have in this situation? Did the participants really understand, that they feel they had to respond or they had to go along? And also the fact that they're told, despite the kicking on the wall and the silence that follows, they are told that these shocks are painful but not dangerous. So they have to assume that maybe, hey, this is a scientific study at Yale. They wouldn't let me really hurt somebody, right? So there's lots of discussion as to why people did what they did, but that doesn't change the fact that the study was really groundbreaking and that it had a huge impact on people's understanding of human nature. So let's talk very quickly about the ethics associated with the study. There were many subsequent interviews with the participants, and Milgram was trying to do his best, based upon his sort of working knowledge of ethics at the time, to make sure that people were not being hurt by this. I think by today's standards, we would feel very different. This is what Milgram found, though. He found that 84% of the participants who were surveyed later said they were glad or very glad to have participated. 15% chose a neutral response. He got 92% of all of the people who had participated to answer, right? So he wasn't able to contact a few. We don't know what happened with those people or what their responses would have been. He says many later wrote expressing thanks. He received offers of assistance and requests to join the staff from former participants. And 6 years later, he received a letter at the height of the Vietnam War. And this is a really interesting thing that he presents as evidence that there was value in the study. This is a quote from Milgram about the letter. And so this is Milgram quoting the letter from this individual who participated. While I was a subject in 1964, though I believed that I was hurting someone, I was totally unaware of why I was doing so. Few people ever realize when they are acting according to their own beliefs and when they are meekly submitting to authority. To permit myself to be drafted with the understanding that I am submitting to authority's demand to do something very wrong would make me frightened of myself. I am fully prepared to go to jail if I am not granted conscientious objector status. Indeed, it is the only course I could take to be faithful in what I believe. My only hope is that members of my draft board act equally according to their conscience. So this is a former participant who has decided to claim conscientious objector status and refuse to be drafted to go serve in Vietnam based upon what they learned about themselves in the process of this study. Diana Baumrind, as I mentioned before, she was a well-known psychologist, published an article in 1964, basically her thoughts on the ethics of the research in Milgram's study, and they kind of went back and forth in the journal discussing the possible ethics of it. The study has been obviously applied to a lot of things, our understanding of the Holocaust first and foremost, and there's some criticisms of how it really doesn't accurately reflect what occurred in Nazi Germany. Obviously, this is a very tightly controlled, limited scope study conducted in an experiment under very different conditions than being told that you have to, inform on your neighbors or participate in the Holocaust, obviously. So some people point out some criticisms. I won't go through all of these, but first and foremost, you're told there's no permanent physical damage. That's very different than, of course, what would happen in the real world. The Holocaust perpetrators were often fully aware that what they were doing was killing people or maiming them. There was no motivation that they're aware of based upon racism or other biases. Now, of course, this is 1961, and at Yale, I believe that every single one of the participants is Caucasian. It's another criticism of the study. They're all male, all right, first and foremost, right? There's also a self-selection idea. Those that chose to participate in this study were not necessarily sadist hate mongers, and they did exhibit some great anguish and conflict, which is inconsistent with some of the things we saw of people who were sort of vehemently in favor of what was being done in Germany. And the experiment lasted for only an hour, so there was really no time for the person to kind of contemplate the implications of their behavior as there would in the ongoing process of something like the Holocaust. So there's some questions about whether or not it's really applicable or generalizable to real world, but it certainly informs us about obedience, and it has sort of a chilling message for a lot of people. So there's several interpretations that Milgram and others have talked about. He talks about what's called the theory of conformism or conformity, but this is the idea that we feel sort of an obligation to act in accordance with a hierarchy, especially like someone who's wearing a lab coat and telling us what to do. We're looking to that person as a behavioral model. The idea of what's called agentic theory. Do I feel like an agent? Or am I acting in accordance as part of a larger mechanism? So did the person say, well, I'm part of this experiment. It's not me really doing this of my own free will. I'm just participating in the structure that's in front of me. So there were several replications over the years. Milgram himself did several replications. He describes 19 variations of the experiment in his book he published in 1974, some of which he had not previously published. There were several things to sort of manipulate variables and see how it changed people's responses. Varying the distance between the participant and the learner. So the closer you are, like on the other side of the wall, your compliance decreases. If the person is further away, then, like for example, then you're more likely to continue. Now you can go the opposite direction. There was one where you had to hold the learner's arm onto a shock plate. 30% of participants completed that experiment as opposed to the majority in this one. Compliance also decreases if the experimenter is further away. The person giving you the instructions, if they're doing it over a phone, for example, as opposed to in the room, compliance decreases to 21%. And then in that case, what's really interesting is some participants deceived the experimenter by pretending to continue. So they would say, okay, 300 volts, and they would not push the switch. There was no video going on, so all they had was the telephonic communication. There was an all-female contingent used. As I said previously, all participants had been men. Obedience did not significantly differ amongst women, though they did communicate higher levels of stress associated with the study. So there's lots of ways that we've sort of looked at the variables. There were plenty of replications. There's been some really cool ones done with technology. Interestingly enough, people still experience distress when they're shocking a avatar, like a computerized recipient, if the person looks like they're actually in pain, even though it's a completely computer-generated image. So there's plenty of examples of people trying to replicate this in different settings, and there's been lots of documentaries and TV shows that have talked about it. So that's the study, sort of in a nutshell. An important implication, obviously, is the ethics, right? Is how is this related to the ethical principles in research? Let's talk about how it relates a little bit to some of the ethics we talked about in the previous lecture. I think the most important one, obviously, is beneficence and non-maleficence, right? Is there harm caused to the participant by putting them through this experience of shocking someone? Now, of course, there's no actual harm done, but in the moment, the person does not understand that because of the deception. So they are going through an experience of finding themselves delivering what they believe are potentially harmful shocks to this person. Again, they're told there's not, but they're getting this feedback kicking on the wall and silence afterwards that implies, well, yeah, maybe there is something going wrong here. Is that doing harm? Is that serving them in a way that's beneficent as well? So that's an issue. The other issue, of course, that's really the most commonly discussed issue for Milgram's study is the idea of deception in research. Is it ethical to deceive participants about what's going on? And that's also connected to the APA principle of respect for people's rights and dignity. Self-determination being really the key issue here. I think that Milgram makes a very valid argument that you can't do this study without deception, right? People have a tendency to present themselves in a positive light. If you tell them, hey, we're testing how you respond to authority, well, many of us want to be seen as I would be the one who would stand up and say no, right? We have this sort of, desire to present ourselves in a positive light. Most of us do. And so if you tell the person what you're studying, you don't get valid results. And I think most people agree that that's probably the case. So he justifies the deception based upon that. The question then is, how do we take the results of this study, the value, how it informs science, how it informs our understanding of obedience, we put that on the scales with the possible harm to the participants. Now, as I said, Milgram did a lot of follow-up, and he claims there was no serious harm to the participants based upon the letter he receives from the guy who's decided to follow his values and conscientiously object to going to Vietnam. You might even say that it did some people some good to go through that experience of seeing how easily they could obey and how that changed their perception of themselves for the better over time. But ultimately, that's the question, right? Is does the potential for harm outweigh the potential for gain from this study? And that's what I want you to think about in terms of the ethics of research. Milgram's study is important for a lot of reasons, but I really think it stands out mostly because of this question. Is it okay to do things that potentially harm our subjects, granted minimal harm, if it gains us something important? And that's a difficult question to answer, and it is a question about really not just ethics but morality. And so we can't simply say yes or no. There's debate to be had, and there's discussion to be had. So that's what I want you to think about when you read the article. I want you to think about what it would be like to be the participant, what it would be like to be the researcher, developing this, and whether or not you would feel okay doing this type of study. Now, the truth of the matter is that there have been plenty of replications of this study relatively recently. Some as recently as in the 2000s. I'm curious whether or not an institutional review board would approve this study today. I can't answer that question. I'm not sure. But I do think times have changed. I think certainly the influence of that more humanistic perspective versus this kind of cold, logical, positivist approach to science has changed how we think about potential for harm, and probably increases our concern for the well-being of the participant over the benefits of the results. There's been I think, a shift from the time that this study was conducted. But there's still certainly plenty of studies that utilize deception, and plenty of studies that have the potential to cause some degree of harm that is, arguably outweighed by their benefits. So that's what I want you to consider when you think about Milgram's study. Okay.